The train station was a skeleton of itself, an echo of human activity fading into the cold night. Jenna glanced at her watch, 10:47 p.m. She clutched her coat tighter against the icy air, watching the frost creep along the edges of the platform lights. The train's distant whistle carried through the stillness, a low, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate in her chest. She was alone, truly alone. Not even a station guard in sight. A growing unease twisted in her gut, though she told herself it was just exhaustion from the long day. When the train screeched into view, its headlights splitting the fog like ghostly eyes, she exhaled a sigh of relief. But even as it rolled to a stop, its doors hissing open, the air seemed to shift, colder, heavier. The interior was no more welcoming. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a pale, sickly glow on the empty seats. She hesitated before stepping inside, her footsteps echoing hollowly. The carriage smelled faintly of metal and something acrid, like burnt plastic. As the doors slid shut behind her, the sense of isolation deepened, settling over her like a second coat. She walked to the middle of the carriage, her boots clicking against the floor. Settling into a seat by the window, she tucked her bag onto her lap. Outside, the station disappeared into the night as the train surged forward. Frosted trees blurred past the window, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the tracks. Jenna tried to shake off the unease, pulling out her book. But the words swam before her eyes, and she couldn't focus. A strange rhythm filled the air, a faint, persistent thrum beneath the hum of the train's engine. She closed the book, letting her gaze wander. That's when she noticed him. 2 rows behind her, partially obscured by the tall seatbacks, a man sat still as a statue. His face was turned toward the window, his features lost to the dim reflections. She hadn't seen him when she boarded. Had he been there the whole time? The sense of isolation shifted into something sharper. Unease prickled at the back of her neck. She told herself it was nothing. People often kept to themselves on night trains. Maybe he was returning from a late shift, just like she was. Maybe he hadn't wanted to attract attention. But why did it feel like he was watching her, even though his face was turned away? Jenna glanced at her phone. No signal. Of course. Her heart thudded in her chest, each beat echoing louder in the quiet carriage. The train rumbled on, and the man didn't move, didn't shift in his seat. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering intermittently. When the train began to slow, her relief was short-lived. Through the window, she saw the faint outline of a station, small, empty, shrouded in shadows. As the train rolled past without stopping, a knot tightened in her stomach. That station was supposed to be her first stop. Jenna frowned, pressing her face to the glass as the station disappeared into the night. The name of the platform was barely visible through the fog. Langley Cross. She was sure it was on the route. She had double-checked the schedule before boarding. Why hadn't the train stopped? Her fingers hovered over her phone again. Still no signal. She glanced around the carriage, hoping for some sign of explanation. An intercom, a timetable, anything. But the space was as empty and sterile as before, devoid of answers. The man behind her shifted. The sound was subtle, a faint rustle of fabric, a creak of the seat. But in the stillness, it was deafening. Jenna's pulse quickened as she cast a sidelong glance over her shoulder. His silhouette remained frozen, his face still turned toward the window. Yet something about his posture felt different, like he was more aware now, watching, even though he wasn't looking. She turned back quickly, her heart hammering. You're being paranoid, she thought. But the sense of dread coiled tighter with every second. The train's lights flickered again, plunging the carriage into brief darkness. When they buzzed back on, Jenna saw her reflection in the window, and just behind it, the faint outline of the man's face. He had turned, his features still obscured by shadow, but unmistakably facing her now. She shot upright, clutching her bag. Her breath fogged the cold air as she stepped into the aisle. The man didn't move, didn't react, but she could feel the weight of his gaze pressing against her back as she moved toward the door leading to the next carriage. She pressed the button to open it, but it didn't respond. A sick knot of panic formed in her chest as she pressed it again, harder this time. The man's footsteps echoed behind her. Slow, deliberate. He wasn't rushing, but the sound of each step seemed to reverberate through her body, louder than the train's wheels clattering against the tracks. Jenna whirled around, expecting to see him standing right behind her. But the aisle was empty. The man was still in his seat, his head tilted slightly, as though amused by her fear. The train shuddered, its brakes squealing. Jenna stumbled, grabbing a pole for balance. Relief surged through her as the next station came into view. A larger, well-lit platform with its name in bold letters. Bridgewater. She stepped toward the door, bracing herself to exit. But once again, the train rolled past without slowing. Something was wrong. Terribly, inexplicably wrong. She turned back toward the man, her voice trembling as she called out, "Excuse me, do you know why the train isn't stopping?" He didn't respond. But his smile, small, chilling, and deliberate, spread across his face like a crack splitting the night. The train plunged into a tunnel, and the world outside the windows vanished, swallowed by darkness. Jenna's reflection stared back at her, pale and strained, the fluorescent lights overhead making her look ghostly. The man was still seated, his posture unnervingly casual, like someone enjoying a private joke. But Jenna's instincts screamed otherwise. There was nothing casual about this. The tunnel seemed endless, the train's rhythmic clatter reverberating through the oppressive silence. Her breath caught when she saw it, the faintest ripple of movement in the glass behind her reflection. She turned sharply. Nothing. The man hadn't moved. His eyes, dull, unblinking, remained fixed on her. A hollow laugh escaped her lips, shaky and brittle. "You're imagining things. It's late. You're tired." But even as she thought it, the sensation of being watched grew sharper, like a needle pricking the nape of her neck. She needed answers. Her feet moved before her brain caught up, carrying her down the aisle toward the rear door of the carriage. The space stretched out unnaturally, the rows of seats repeating like a looping film reel. The door wasn't far, yet it felt miles away, the air thickening with every step. Jenna glanced over her shoulder, heart hammering. The man was no longer in his seat. Her breath hitched. A chill swept over her, sinking into her bones. "Hello," she called, her voice barely louder than the hum of the train. No answer. The carriage was empty. The hair on her arm stood on end as she reached the door and pressed the button. It didn't budge. Panic surged, and she jabbed at it again, harder this time, but the mechanism refused to respond. Beyond the frosted glass, she could just make out the next carriage, a long, dim corridor bathed in shadow. A sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic tap. It wasn't the train, it was deliberate. Footsteps. They weren't coming from behind her. They were ahead, in the next carriage. Jenna froze, the blood roaring in her ears. She strained to see through the glass, but the shadows in the adjacent carriage were impenetrable. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. Silence, heavy and expectant, filled the space. She forced herself to knock on the glass, her hand trembling. "Hello? Is someone there?" A shape stirred in the shadows, tall, vague, moving with a strange, disjointed grace. It advanced toward her, step by step, until its outline sharpened into something distinctly human. But as the figure came closer, Its gait seemed wrong, too fluid, as though it were gliding rather than walking. Jenna stumbled back, her chest tightening. The door between the carriages jolted, as if something on the other side had tried to push it open. She fumbled for her phone, willing it to show a signal, but the screen remained stubbornly blank. The door jolted again, harder this time. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice cracking. A faint whisper threaded through the air, too quiet to discern. Jenna pressed herself against the wall, her pulse hammering in her throat. She stared at the door, expecting it to burst open at any moment. But then the noise stopped. The train jolted, emerging from the tunnel, and the figure was gone. The train was moving faster now. Trees and fields blurred past the windows, their outlines distorted by the frost clinging to the glass. Jenna staggered back to her seat, gripping the armrest to steady herself. The eerie calm that followed the tunnel left her nerves frayed. The man had disappeared, and so had the figure in the next carriage. But something told her the worst wasn't over. She looked around, searching for a conductor's emergency button or an intercom. Nothing. The lack of safety features felt deliberate, like the train had been stripped of anything that might offer reassurance. Her hands clenched into fists as she whispered to herself, "Get a grip. Just find someone who can explain this." The door to the front of the carriage loomed ahead, its frosted glass reflecting her wary expression. With a deep breath, she moved toward it, each step amplifying the gnawing unease. This door opened with a hiss, and she stepped into the next carriage. The space was identical to the one she'd left, but colder, darker. The lights flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows across the seats. In the far corner, slouched on a bench, was a figure in uniform, a conductor. Relief surged through her like a tidal wave. "Excuse me," she called, hurrying toward him. "Something's wrong with the train. It's skipping stops, and there's this man." She froze mid-sentence. The conductor's head tilted slowly toward her, his face obscured by the brim of his cap. His uniform was immaculate, but unnaturally pristine, as though untouched by time. The patch on his chest read, "R. Beckett." "Are you in charge?" she asked hesitantly. He didn't respond. His shoulders twitched slightly, as if struggling to move. Jenna leaned closer, dread pooling in her stomach. His breathing was faint, almost imperceptible, and his body seemed unnaturally rigid. She reached out to touch his arm, hoping to rouse him. His head snapped up, revealing hollow, glassy eyes. Jenna stumbled back, a scream lodged in her throat. The conductor didn't move, didn't blink, but his mouth opened slightly, emitting a soft, mechanical sound, a static hum interspersed with fragmented whispers. "Please," she begged, her voice shaking. "I need help." The conductor's lips barely moved, but a single word escaped, distorted and drawn out. "Trap." Jenna's knees buckled as the word reverberated through her mind. Before she could react, the lights flickered again, and the conductor slumped forward, lifeless. The train lurched violently, nearly throwing her to the floor. When she looked up, the door to the next carriage was wide open, the darkness beyond beckoning like a hungry void. The open door yawned before her, revealing only darkness. A chill seeped from the void, carrying an almost imperceptible hum, like distant machinery. Jenna clutched the edge of the doorway, her breath shallow, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the train jolted again, as though urging her forward, and she realized the choice had already been made. She stepped across the threshold. The air was colder here, dense and suffocating. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound swallowed too quickly by the oppressive silence. The carriage was shrouded in shadows, the lights overhead dimming and flickering in spasmodic bursts. Seats lined either side, but they were empty, save for faint impressions on the cushions, as though passengers had just vacated them. Jenna's heart raced as she moved down the aisle. The sensation of being watched pressed against her like a weight. Shadows along the walls stretched and twisted, their edges too sharp, too deliberate, as though they were not cast by light but something else entirely. At the far end of the carriage, she saw it. A figure standing motionless by the final door. It was tall and broad, its form shrouded in darkness. The dim light glinted off its outline, revealing the faint sheen of a conductor's uniform. For a moment, hope flickered in Jenna's chest. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It stood unnervingly still, its head slightly tilted, as though listening. Jenna's steps faltered, her breath catching in her throat. Something about its presence felt wrong, like an object out of place, something that shouldn't exist. She took another step closer, her fingers brushing against the seatbacks for support. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's happening. I just need to get off this train." The figure shifted, a slow, mechanical motion that sent a shiver down her spine. It turned to face her fully, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all. The features were smooth and blank, like a mannequin's, the eyes two hollow voids that reflected nothing. Yet Jenna felt its gaze pierce her, searching her, reading her in a way no human ever could. Her knees threatened to buckle, but she held her ground. The figure raised one hand, gloved fingers curling in a slow beckon. It stepped closer, its movements unnervingly fluid, as if it floated rather than walked. "No," Jenna whispered, stumbling back. "Stay away." The figure stopped, its head tilting again, as though amused. From behind it, the door to the next carriage creaked open, revealing a swirling darkness that seemed alive, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. A faint whisper threaded through the air, soft at first, then louder, clearer. 1,000 fractured voices overlapping in a discordant chorus. "Join us," they murmured. "Come home." Jenna clamped her hands over her ears, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't real," she muttered, closing her eyes tightly. "It's just a nightmare." But when she opened them, the figure was closer, looming over her. Its featureless face seemed to ripple, as though something beneath the surface was struggling to emerge. The whispers grew louder, their words piercing her mind like needles. "No," she shouted, stumbling back until she hit a wall. The train shuddered violently, the lights overhead bursting in a shower of sparks. For a moment, everything plunged into darkness. And then there was silence. Jenna's breathing slowed as the oppressive whispers faded. She opened her eyes cautiously, her heart pounding. The carriage was empty. The figure was gone. Only the faint hum of the train's engine remained, steady and unbroken. Her eyes darted to the window. Through the frost-covered glass, she saw a platform appear, bright, bustling, alive. People stood waiting in clusters, their faces illuminated by warm yellow lights. Relief surged through her like a tidal wave. The train screeched to a halt, its doors sliding open with a hiss. Jenna didn't hesitate. She grabbed her bag and bolted down the aisle, stepping onto the platform with trembling legs. The cold air felt sharp and real against her skin, and the sound of voices and laughter grounded her in reality. She turned back toward the train, expecting to see the faceless figure watching from the shadows. But the carriages were empty, the windows dark. The train's whistle blew, and it rolled forward, disappearing into the night. Jenna stood frozen on the platform, her mind reeling. Around her, the station hummed with life, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her. The shadows beneath the platform lights stretched unnaturally long, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a familiar figure among the crowd, tall, broad, and featureless. She blinked, and it was gone. As she stepped into the station's warm glow, A single thought gnawed at her mind. Had she truly escaped? Or had the train's trap only just begun?